Hey all, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about something a little neat. It's about how to design your own Hive city, which is actually really fun. It's a lot of fun to do, and I have my own little Hive city that I call Arabella that I have been working on in some way, shape, or form for years, and I've included it in my videos, like as an example. The hive that I drew in my video on Hive cities, that's Arabella. Obviously, it's not a canon hive, but it is designed to be accurate to how a hive would be structured. So I came up with this whole map of a hive, and it took me about 30 hours to do, to make, give or take. 30 hours over the course of a few days, spread out, a week, give or take. I can't exactly remember the time frame. And, well, I thought of the hive as, basically, you could think of a hive as a pyramid, right? But it's made of mashed potatoes, and a toddler has kind of just dragged their fork through the mashed potatoes, and the mashed potatoes just becomes this weird, lumpy, spiky mound. That's the best way to describe what a hive looks like, and is designed like, from the outside. And a lot of people seem to assume that that just means that it's just a giant mountain. And that is the easiest way to portray a hive. I mean, that's how I designed Arabella. But hives could be more than one mound. They could be different. They could be sprawling. But if there's one thing that defines a hive, it is density and verticality. So let's start with density. The reason a hive is dense, despite being so large, is because at the end of the day, this is a hive that is fitting billions upon billions upon billions of people into one single megacity, which is doable, but it's also run down. It is especially in the 41st millennium, it is the culmination of humanity's decay. So it's not efficient. It's kind of just it's kind of just a case of, termites expanding a mound. It isn't really all that sensible. There's not a typical layout for the city. You're not going to see you're not going to see what you would find in, say, Tokyo or New York or London or Kiev. You won't find a traditional layout for the city. And that gets into the next thing. The hives could be a lot bigger, and they are already huge. They're giant cities, but they're very condensed. They're very dense, and this is due to a number of factors. The planets, that they tend to be extremely bad for planets, so the very hostile nature of the area outside of the hive tends to necessitate building up inside of the hive, and as a result, you get verticality. So you have compacted things together, and now you have a lot of structures, some taller, some shorter, all of them intersecting with one another, all of them articulating in some way, shape, or form. And if they are not, and let's say, like in this example I'm about to show you here, where there's open sky above them, even so, down below them, beneath them, those buildings are in some way, shape, or form articulating with one another. So that gets us into this little speed paint. So the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to convey a sense of depth to the hive, and I did look at some old 40k art for inspiration when making this particular piece. So the first thing I did, I made a railway with statues supporting it, but what's most important about this railway is you'll see where it ends. Where it ends is the vanishing point. So in basic perspective art, you will have a horizon line or horizon lines, if you want to get really, really funky with it, and there's going to be these things called vanishing points. So basically, this point is where things are going to intersect. So if you are, say, doing 1-point perspective, and this piece is actually 2-point perspective, but we'll get to that in a second, you can only draw 3 types of lines: horizontal lines, vertical lines, and lines that intersect with the vanishing point. So because this is 2-point perspective, as you can see now, you can now do horizontal lines, vertical lines, and lines that go to either vanishing point. And you'll see one thing about these buildings, which is that they don't really make a hell of a lot of sense. They're kind of just amalgamations of Gothic architecture with random bits and protrusions added onto the side. And there's a reason for this, which is that 40K architecture isn't meant to be sensible. It isn't meant to be, something that you can reasonably put down as like, oh yeah, this structure would make sense. But when you look at the purpose of the protrusions in 40K's lore, it makes sense for the Imperium. So as an example, the Skyway Minoris, that's what I named the little smaller bridge towards the bottom left of the screen that leads into that building, well, it goes into that building and goes through it. Well, there's automobiles in the Imperium. A lot of people tend to not realize that. So they're going to generate a lot of smog and fumes. So something needs to, get out all of that excess smog and pollution. So you have these stacks on top of this building. Again, it's not the most sensible, but for the Imperium, it does work. And the other thing to note is, see how I'm trying to keep everything clustered here? How everything, while they are clearly their own individual things, it's all so condensed and clustered together. That's because, well, it's a hive, and even when there is space, things are still going to get clustered together. The other thing to note is that hives are very, very, very old, so you're not really gonna see much new stuff in quotation marks. Typically, the Imperium's motto is maintain, repair, and recover if if necessary. So you have to consider that with hives. I apologize, my allergies are killing me right now. I need to get my allergy shots going again. So there's that. Again, the Imperium, its buildings don't necessarily make the most sense, but they look cool, they're Gothic, and for the Imperium, it makes sense. But going back to my whole point about hives being old, hives, well, how do I put this? So I'm gonna bring up an example from Arabella, the hive that I've been working on. So towards the bottom left of the artwork, you're going to see what looks like a crashed vessel. And if you look at it, a bridge has been constructed between the two halves of that vessel, and the city is kind of just grown to overtake it. That's what I mean by hives are old. It just kind of eventually grows to overtake bits and pieces and incorporates external elements within itself. So a crashed ship, well, it's too big to really be moved, and well, the Imperium's bureaucracy means that it can't really get salvaged in an efficient manner. So as a result, it kind of just gets incorporated into the city. And the story behind this vessel, for my little hive here, is that when it crashed, well, its power generators were still semi-functional, and it crashed in the lower hive. In the lower hive, you have to pay a premium for things like power for your homes. So what a lot of people have done is they are now squatting in this semi-radioactive ship because free power. And as a result, it's kind of just become a part of the city. So things like that. That's what you want to think about with a hive. You want to think about everything being connected to everything, and you want to envision it as this termite mound that this termite mound slash mashed potato pile that grows and overtakes things, but then like isn't uniform and has like the toddler moving their fork through it. But what if we go down to the street level? I'm working on some street level art for the hives. So one thing that becomes especially prevalent in when you get down to like the person level, like the level where you are, walking down a street in a hive, you need to convey enormity. And if you don't want to convey enormity, then you need to convey a sense of being cramped. Because again, the hives, despite being so huge, are incredibly condensed. So as a result, you're going to see this is where you're going to see that intersecting, articulating nature. And actually, Darktide, the 40K game that's kind of like Left 4 Dead, and it's made by Fat Shark. The devs made a little developer diary talking about how they design levels, and in it they talk about how they design Tertium, the hive that you fight in 40K, not 40K, in Darktide. And well, their whole point was that you can't, as I said earlier, you can't really take a traditional city's layout and apply it to a hive. So as a result, you kind of got to think of it as a bunch of sectioned off boxes with a bunch of tunnels and stairs and bridges and things all connecting with each other. Sometimes they're smushed against one another. Sometimes there's, sometimes people, as like a stopgap measure, have like made these very shoddy additions themselves out of like sheet metal or rotting wood to bridge gaps, especially in like the more rundown parts of a hive, because the hive can't really afford to keep itself up. And hi Joey, hi Pupper, the dog has joined me. So with that in mind, you have to look at the inner parts of a hive as just tunnels, tunnels within that mound. But you know what? I'm gonna go back to my little speed paint here. So you're gonna notice why am I just adding in all these blocks? And I'm just gonna quickly pause it here. So why am I adding in all of these blocks? The reason I added in all of those blocks is because I intended to texture them, but again, the point was to condense and convey this cramped nature of the hive. And to really solidify that, I also like to use dark backgrounds because negative space is very good. Negative space kind of just, it's a whole thing. I've never been the best with terms, but negative space kind of just refers to like empty space that is used to convey depth, that is used to fill in a scene, so that way it isn't feeling awkward or empty. But I kind of just decided to move away from the blocks, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to say that this area is kind of in like the outskirts of the lower hive, and so then I decided, okay, I'm going to have this little mound, but then I'm gonna have like the eraser shaped as a block, and I'm gonna just add in all those little streaks. And you're gonna see that the goal of this, there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason. I'm pretty random, but I'm also trying to be clustered with it. I'm trying to be clustered with the strokes of the eraser, because it isn't. I don't want it to be uniform, but I also don't want it to be completely random. I want it to be clustered together, and I want there to be a little bit of a sense of depth. Now, another thing about hives is they're very dark, but the hives themselves are pretty bright. So right now what I'm doing is I am adding in lights, various different lights, and I'm playing around with them, adding them in clusters, and I'm playing around with the bloom effect, the bloom stuff in After Effects, not After Effects, Procreate. And the goal is I'm going to combine this bloom effect with negative space to to make the hive, look like a hive. So now we're getting into that, toddler carving into the hive thing, because you'll notice that I'm now like just adding in extra smaller mounds and adding it and adding in dips and things like that. I also made use of the erasing tool, not the erasing tool. The I did make use of the erasing tool. I also made use of the blur tool and the bloom tool and the sharpen tool. And the reason for this is I kind of wanted to give it this aesthetic of like a painted background against an inked foreground. So as a result, you have this very pretty, background that's blurred. It doesn't need much detail, but you could tell that there's stuff behind it, and it acts as a supplement for this foreground here. So, the other thing you'll notice is I'm keeping to a consistent, I'm keeping to a very consistent color palette here. The reason for that is, the color pink would look very awkward here, and unless I'm like trying to make it awkward, this is the best way I could put it. So you'll notice, hey, why am I like suddenly darkening things? Well, that's because of the lighting, and hives are very, very, and I cannot emphasize this enough, very dark. Yes, you occasionally get sunlight, but the fact of the matter is that hives are pumping out so much smog and toxic fumes and pollution into the atmosphere that it is not uncommon for, sunlight to not be able to filter through these thick clouds. And so as a result, you have, very little cases of natural sunlight in the hive. And as a result, the hive kind of has to rely on its own lighting, its own lights to provide illumination for the populace. And so as a result, things get really dark really fast. And so that actually works into my favor here, because I can use the lighting to convey depth, to convey height, right? So, the bottom, the bottom of the hive, the more condensed part of the hive, it's going to be brighter. It's going to be a lot shinier, right? Whereas the top of the hive, it's gonna be a little darker, but it has its own lights. But because this isn't the very, very top of the hive, and there's actually a lot of hive to go, that part of the hive is also shining on to these buildings here, and so you're going to see, the background has presence. So it's not just a pretty little thing to look at. It is meant to add depth. It's meant to supplement the foreground, as I said. Now, unfortunately, a side effect of how I do my art is a lot of the details I ink gets lost, but I actually don't mind that, and I kind of like it that way, if I'm being honest, because it gives it almost this more natural painted feel. And the final thing about it is you want the hive to look lived in, right? It's one thing to just make buildings. It's another thing to actually make them seem lived in, right? So, as an example, you have simple things like this train here, or all these little lights representing people moving across the bridge on the hive. And I'm not fully done with this piece just yet. I do intend to add things like ships moving in the background, and maybe some twinkling lights and things like that. And I also intend to animate it. This is going to be one of my animated backgrounds for an upcoming video. And yeah, so that's a very rambly gist on how to make your own hive city. It's not necessarily meant to be like a fully comprehensive thing. It's just getting into my mindset, how I think of things, the way I kind of conduct myself while going through it. And Yeah, with all that in mind, I will see you in the Cosmos, friends.